I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we take a look at the role the monarchy plays in the lives of British Columbians. Bet that hasn't crossed your mind recently. King Charles III is represented in Canada by the Governor-General in Ottawa and in our province by the Lieutenant Governor. For the past 7 years, that has been the Honourable Janet Austin. It's not uncommon for people to think this role is purely ceremonial. It is not. This is the highest-ranking position in government. The Lieutenant Governor has the authority to summons, prorogue, and dissolve the legislature. And we've seen a few recent examples of this. For instance, in January, the Prime Minister, Trudeau, sought the permission of Governor-General Mary Simon to prorogue or interrupt Parliament for a period of time. She agreed. Prime Minister Harper was similarly successful in convincing Governor-General Michaelle Jean to prorogue his Parliament. And in a rather tumultuous time in our province, Christy Clark, unable to elect a majority, asked our Lieutenant Governor, Judith Guichon at the time, to call an election. But she basically said no, and instead gave John Horgan the opportunity to form a government. And the rest is history. So influence for sure. And of course, there is a ceremonial aspect as well, hosting distinguished guests, honoring award recipients, recognizing the contributions of outstanding British Columbians, and in the name of the King, honoring Indigenous traditions and heritage. Janet Austin has been an exemplary role model as our 30th Lieutenant Governor. As her honor's term comes to an end, we take a look back. Janet Austin joins us right after this break. The Honourable Janet Austin is with us. And Janet, I was thinking it's almost 7 years since you took on this role.
Absolutely. I'm in the 7th year of a 5-year term, and I have loved every minute of it.
What surprised you when you first arrived? Because you were in the public realm before, so you knew a lot of that part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I've, certainly done my share of, of public speaking, both with the Board of Trade and the YWCA. I think I had a pretty good idea of what the role would entail. And I thought very carefully about it before I actually agreed to have my name put forward. So what surprised me? Not much, to be honest, really not much. I had a pretty good grip on it, I think. And I think the things that surprised me were all good. The relationships that I've been able to build, the opportunities to travel the province, to really understand the diversity of the province, the different interests, needs, and concerns of people throughout British Columbia. That has really, I think, deepened my understanding of our province in a really positive way.
I was surprised right from the beginning. You had several strong ideas of things you wanted to pursue. And it's a tricky position, being Lieutenant Governor, because you have to stay away from politics and much controversy. But a lot of the big issues of our time, whether it's democracy or whatever, they're very big, complicated issues. But you managed to walk that fine line.
Yeah, I certainly did my best. I think something that has been advantageous for me is that I've always had a reputation as a nonpartisan. I found that has served me well and served the organizations that I've been associated with in the past. And so I think people don't perceive me as having an agenda. I also previously worked hard on what I would consider to be foundational issues by bringing people with a broad variety of views together, and trying to rise above what might be short-term partisan interests.
So why democracy?
Well, I think it's absolutely fundamental. And as we look around the world today, we can see the fragility of democracy in jurisdictions around the world. So I felt very strongly that we needed to protect our public institutions and our democratic conventions. I was deeply concerned about the future for journalism. We absolutely need credible, independent journalism in order to have a well-informed citizenry that can fully participate in a constructive way in political decision-making. And of course, with the advent of social media and the tsunami of technological innovation, that was being undermined. And so I have spoken a lot throughout my term. I've worked with various universities about how to strengthen democracy, and I feel good about that. But lately, I've come to reflect a bit more on the fact that protecting our democratic frameworks and institutions is insufficient in itself. Because as we can see historically and in the present to some extent, democracies can vote themselves into fascism. And so I feel increasingly the need and the value of reinforcing the underlying values that are foundational to our democratic systems.
So how are you going to do that?
I'm not sure. I don't know what I'm going to do next. I will hope to continue to play a role. In terms of next, when it comes to democracy, one of the challenges is getting people whose views are different to engage constructively. And I think we're all schooled in negotiation and debate. And when we're talking to someone, we're often thinking about, well, how am I going to counter that person's point of view? And I don't think we put nearly enough emphasis on listening and a willingness to change our views when confronted with superior reasoning or argumentation. So I'm actually quite interested in deliberative democracy structures, which will bring together a diverse group of people, who agree to work together in a sustained way, brought up perhaps to a consistent level of knowledge on a particular topic, and then are supported to try to find those places of compromise, in between the extremes of public opinion. And I think that has two advantages. One is, is a way to break through disinformation and misinformation. And secondly, it requires people to engage in a sustained way over time. And I think those are really fundamental to getting the best. Like, the best of democracy is enabling people whose views are different to share power. And I think that's what can happen. So I believe we need to see some, perhaps, exercises, some examples to see whether this might be helpful. And I think there's good evidence that it can be in other jurisdictions.
I remember you saying to me one of the greatest powers you had was the power to convene.
Absolutely.
Elaborate on that.
Well, when you're the lieutenant governor and you phone someone and say, do you want to come and have a cup of tea with me to talk about X? They pretty much always say yes, And so having the privilege of the office, which is a neutral, nonpartisan, unifying office, and calling people together, to have those thoughtful discussions, which can be difficult to do in public, and doing it in a way which respects the privacy of the people involved, can allow people sometimes to let down their hair a little bit and have a conversation which isn't so carefully parsed and more honest. And we need that kind of engagement as a precursor to any kind of, really constructive and sustained change.
I wonder where the home for this will be. In a sense, the first thing you'd say was, well, university, that's where it should happen. But our universities have been having a lot of issues lately where they're not allowing speech on both sides and they're not allowing the roundness of debate. So I'm not sure if that would be the home for this. Do you have any other ideas?
Well, one does automatically go to universities, and I do think they have a lot to offer. The challenge, of course, is I think they're not always as connected to the kinds of decisions that are made in the public realm, So how do we connect to the political level constructively? I don't know an awful lot about this, but I'm interested to learn more about how Ireland uses deliberative democracy structures, because they have used them to deal with things like same-sex marriage, abortion, sort of single issues. But I know there is a stronger connection to the political level and a stronger degree of engagement, and also broader, I would say, broader public engagement. So I don't know much about it, but I do want to learn more. So I do think that there's a role for government. One area, and I'm just going to say this, one area where I think we could perhaps have a useful exercise would be around the opioid crisis, because all of us have some connection, a family friend, a colleague who has experienced that challenge. And it's a kind of grounding principle that can unify people. So I think an exercise like that might be quite interesting, but it would need to involve government and possibly an academic institution or organizations that are part of civil society. So I don't have a clear sense of how that could be structured, but I think these things are worth considering.
Ambassador to Ireland, maybe?
Oh, yeah, I think somebody else really, really wanted that job. But I think I think it's worth really looking around and seeing, you know, the different ways that different jurisdictions use democracy and what's most successful, when it's successful, particularly in this current context.
And you're right that I think in the past, I guess simplistically, we thought, well, if everybody's voting, then that's democracy and everything's going to be swell.
Right.
But as you have pointed out, sometimes the vote is not in a direction that you might have expected.
Well, absolutely, or, you know, that isn't necessarily in the best interests of you know, the collective best interests. So, you know, we see that time and time again, for sure. I think people often think, you know, we hear a lot about polarization. They think the opposite of polarization is uniformity of opinion. And of course, that's the opposite, because we absolutely need a diverse array of different perspectives.
And we'll get back to two other issues that I know Janet's very involved with, trafficking and concussions, right after this break. I have said to our Lieutenant Governor, Janet Austin, that I've been to all of her speeches. And you said, well, respectfully, but no. How many speeches have you done?
Well, I just reflecting back on the last 7 years, our estimate is more than 2,000 speeches written and delivered.
And the interesting thing is you write your own speeches.
I do.
Why?
Well, you know, I enjoy the exercise. I like the discipline of trying to say something meaningful as succinctly and effectively as possible. So that's one thing. But also, I have difficulty delivering a speech that someone else has written for me because it doesn't always feel genuine. And when someone has the goodwill to give you a time on their platform, when they could invite many other people to speak, I feel a responsibility to make sure that what I have to say is meaningful to them, demonstrates that I've made an effort to really understand their issues, and add some value, you know, to the whole exercise.
So your interest and your curiosity, of course, coming out of your social services background to a great extent, have resulted in some surprising findings, like, for instance, concussions.
Yeah.
I remember you very emotionally talking about, we don't really think about the broad scope of concussions. We just think about the hockey player gets hit in the head.
Yeah.
Tell me what you've discovered.
So, you know, as someone who has, you know, led the YWCA and worked not directly on the front lines of domestic violence, but has been responsible for those programs at a higher level, you know, I thought I was pretty well informed. But I met a wonderful group of people at a society in Victoria called the CRIDGE, and they have expertise both in domestic violence and in brain injury. And they had participated in, I think it was a national study that demonstrated that essentially for one, you know, sort of high-profile concussion or brain injury from sport, there were 7,000, and that's not a mistake, similar injuries from domestic violence.
So say that again, for one sports injury that we would see and it'd be very visible.
Yes.
7,000?
7,000. It's hard to believe. People hear that and they don't believe it. But there are two things there. One is it does bring attention to the ubiquity of violence in our society. But it also, when there is violence, you can appreciate that it's often repeated. So if someone is thrown against a wall or on the floor or is hit, you're always going to have some effect on the brain. Because there's a bit of a culture of repression in our society when it comes to domestic violence, These things are not often spoken of, and so people hear these statistics and they discount them, think that they can't possibly be real. And many women who experience this are reluctant to report because they fear that any medical effect may expose them to the apprehension of their children. So it's very challenging and complex issue.
Trevor Linden, who's become a spokesperson for this issue, said, a sports player, he gets all the attention in the world and all the sympathy. He's got doctors surrounding him. He's got everything. A woman, let's assume for the moment a woman, is she wants to keep it quiet. She's embarrassed or she's ashamed or she's afraid.
Yep.
And so she doesn't get the medical care that's required.
No.
So how do you approach getting at this topic?
Well, I think there needs to be much broader awareness of this. We are having a big public conversation right now about concussion in sport, and I think that's really positive. People need to understand that, but they need to also understand the disparity here. So I will not get these stats right, but when it comes to funding for brain injury, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm just going to give this to you as a sort of an example, but say, I think there was something like $20 million in research funding from a federal agency for brain injury. There was something like 11 million that went to sport-related brain injury and 250,000 for injuries flowing from domestic violence. So you compare that, with the ubiquity of the issue for women. And so I think we need more public awareness of that. We need, research protocols. I was on the founding board of the Women's Health Research Institute, which is an organization set up to deal with the fact that most medical care is based on a male paradigm. And that needs to change. So we need to listen to these organizations, we need to support them, and we need to speak up about these issues. And in that way, I think it will bring more support.
And another very, very difficult topic that you have been looking at closely is trafficking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Don't like to think that it happens in BC.
No. And this really came about through my friendship with Susanna Pierce, who we all know well as the president of Shell Canada. And Susanna approached me with concerns that she was seeing in the resource industry and asked, if I would be willing to work with her to bring some profile to the issue and look at what could be done. And of course, I was delighted. It is a huge problem that people are largely unaware of. When we think of trafficking, we usually think of, Thailand or East European countries. But here in Canada, it is a real problem. And it affects largely Indigenous women and girls, or actually women from Quebec who are trafficked out west and are particularly vulnerable if they're from rural Quebec and they don't speak English. So we need to recognize that these are problems in Canada as well, and that they need to be addressed.
And so when you look back, you've brought so many of these important issues to the surface, and I'm sure you will continue in one way or another touching on them. What advice do you have for the new Lieutenant Governor?
Well, as you know, the new Lieutenant Governor is a close personal friend of both of ours. I don't think she needs advice from me. She is exceptionally well qualified to serve in the role, and it's been my privilege to work with her in support of her work with the Pacific Autism Family Network and the Board of Trade. And so my advice to her is to remember that she's the Lieutenant Governor and that she can make her own decisions. And secondly, just to really enjoy yourself. It's a wonderful opportunity and a great experience, and I know that she will serve exceptionally well.
And one of the complications you had, of course, was you were in this role during COVID.
Yes.
How did you handle that? What did you do? Move out?
Yeah, we did actually. The Government House had a renovation of about 1.5 years, and it was the right time to do it because, of course, we couldn't use it. So we did move out, but I handled it the way we all did. We spent 2 years on Zoom. people could only see us from the shoulders up. So I acquired an extensive set of unusual glasses, and really just, we all did our best. And I think, and even though it was a challenging time, we got through it,
And with that time out, I wonder if it changed your perspective a little bit when you got back to work again.
I think it changed the perspective of everyone, because we really did see how important community is. And we saw as well, we saw people making decisions that had less to do with themselves and more to do about community. So recognizing that for us all to be safe, we had to work together. We couldn't isolate ourselves. It was impossible. And I think that had a very positive effect. The effect hasn't held, I guess, as firmly as I might have hoped, but it's still there. And I think it's very much there in the sort of local community networks that were built during COVID that do persist. And I think those things are incredibly trust building. So my hopes for the future really is, I think we need to adopt a more hopeful narrative around many of the challenges that we're facing. And one example I would give would be of climate. That has been a challenging narrative for everyone. There is a dichotomy, which I think is a false dichotomy, between energy and climate, or energy or climate and the economy. But with all of the new technologies achieving cost competitiveness, I think there's a lot of reason to be hopeful.
Thank you for everything you did, Janet.
Yeah, thank you, Carole.
We'll be back in a moment. We have been blessed in British Columbia with our lieutenant governors. The Honourable Janet Austin brought to the role her compassion, her background in social services, her amazing ability to identify a problem that needed attention and gather together the right group of problem solvers. Add that to her absolutely endless energy and enthusiasm. Thank you, Janet. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.